Ladies, gentlemen, and all you RPG lovers, as always, I am Cosmic, and today we're going to be reviewing I Am Setsuna, developed by Tokyo RPG Factory and published by Square Enix. Tokyo RPG Factory themselves are an in-house studio created by Square Enix to do as their name suggests. I Am Setsuna is a JRPG designed to be part spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger, part love letter to classic RPGs of yore. I Am Setsuna can be roughly translated into I Am Sadness, which not only denotes the name of a main character, but gives away the theme of the game. The game itself is set in a snow-covered world. You play as Endia, a man from a masked tribe of mercenaries, infamous for their love of solitude and the cold-hearted regard in which they carry out their missions. At the start of the game, Endia is sent to kill the Sacrifice, a girl who travels to the Last Lands to offer up her life to stop the monsters from overrunning the land. Upon meeting Setsuna, Endia doesn't kill her but joins her guard and sets out with Setsuna to help complete her journey. Now, I'm not going to give any spoilers to the storyline, but I can tell you there are clear Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy X vibes throughout the story. The story is well written for most part. The dialogue can get a little bit annoying with characters exclaiming that there's no other choice than a specific course of action. Basically, when a character says that there's no other choice all the time, it's blanket justification for this is the reason why, and it's not, frankly, a very good one. I like that much of the game's story deals with serious themes like loss and sorrow, etc. It's a good story, if a little unoriginal at many points. Oh, and the similarities to previous games only gets worse. This guy and this guy, same. This guy and this guy, basically the same. This girl and this girl, that's right, you guessed it, basically the same person. While the game's story remains fairly interesting due to the many JRPG style plot twists, sadly the execution of the story remains somewhat lacking. It feels like it's missing something in the overall execution department, and that's mainly due to the fact that there's no voice acting whatsoever apart from some Japanese voices in the actual battles themselves. I'm not saying a game needs to have voice acting, but in a game that is so dialogue heavy like JRPGs are, voice acting, especially good voice acting, and the type of voice acting that I know Square Enix can produce, would go a long way to giving these characters some life and personality. I also feel many of the dialogue scenes could have been done a lot better. Instead of having just looking down on the characters like the top-down RPG that it is, you could have done a Tales of Vesperia part type of thing with anime cutscenes where it's just static anime sequences and these facial expressions change every now and again depending on what's being said and what's being done, and that just adds a little bit of really nice execution and a little bit of charm to the overall appeal. Now, Tales of Vesperia is one of my all-time favourite RPGs, and I think there's a lot to be learned when you're trying to kind of cut down on a budget, not trying to do really good CGI cutscenes or anything like that. A nice anime cutscene is a really good way to pull off that little extra bit of polish when it comes down to your storytelling. But enough about the story, let's get down to the mechanics. Now, exploration takes part top-down, as does all of the game. The level design of each individual location tends to be fairly linear. There are a couple of places that have mazes and very simplistic puzzles, but for the most part, it's a straight shooter and there's no real reason why you would get lost on any of the levels. I also noticed that many of the locations aren't particularly large, so you should get through many of them in a fairly short space of time. Once you're out of a location, you get taken to the world map. Now, world map traveling is fairly simple. No battles actually occur on the world map. It's just a fairly slow walking process, or once you get further on in the game, you do get transportation, and after that point, it's a fairly easy ride to get where you want to go. For the majority of the game, what you'll be doing is, of course, combat. Now, combat itself employs an active time battle system, which is featured in games in the various entries in the Final Fantasy series, so any players of traditional JRPGs will be right at home with this battle system. It's a fairly simple system in the sense that once an action is taken by a character, the action gauge must fill up again before another action is taken, and vice versa. Now, there is an option for when you are choosing what ability for your character to use that you can put the time in the game pauses, or you can turn that off and have the entire game continue in real time. On top of the ATB battle system, positioning is also a key element in Setsuna. So as you do various actions and various abilities, your characters will move and enemies will move. Now you can't directly control this, which does become frustrating, especially when there are enemies who deal AoE attacks or self-destruct and they're right up close to you and you can't move your character out of the way. It can become a little bit frustrating, but if you're careful and you're tactical, you can use positioning to your advantage. So for example, using an ability like Cyclone, which damages all enemies and pushes them back out of the way, and if you do that at the right time, you then, especially against an enemy who is going to self-destruct at a certain number of HP, you can push them back out of the way. But it does get a little bit frustrating, especially in the tougher battles, especially in boss fights, when positioning is kind of completely out of your control and it's left up to basically chance. On top of this, you also have the momentum system. Now the momentum system works very similar to the action time battle system. Once your action gauge has filled up, your momentum gauge will start filling up, and you can acquire 3 total points on the momentum system. And essentially, once you attack an enemy, you can press a button which will activate one of your momentum gems, which will do a various effects such as additional damage or healing and a number of other effects. There are a couple of other elements to the battle system, but they are very minimal, and ultimately the battle system itself is fairly simplistic and easy to pick up. The problem with the battle system and the combat in general is that it can be fairly monotonous, especially against just normal mobs. You find that it gets repetitive really quickly. The only thing that does add spice to this is of course the boss battles, and luckily they are fairly frequent. Once combat is done, your characters will gain XP to level up. Now there isn't a progression system in terms of XP or leveling, it's just basically your standard stat upgrade. Monsters will also drop ingredients. They don't actually drop loot like equipment or items, they only drop ingredients for you to use to either sell or to use to gain Spirit Knight stones. Which leads me to my biggest gripe of the game, the Spirit Knight system. The entire system is really poorly designed. Spirit Knight stones are created by selling ingredients to a magic consortium trader. Now in towns there will be pretty much 3 or 4 or even 5 vendors at any one town. You can only sell items of any kind to the Magic Consortium member, which means if you want to buy, say, a new sword or a new spear or a potion from the apothecary, you have to go find the Magic Consortium member, sell your items that you don't want to him, then you have to go back to the vendor that you want to buy from to purchase the item, which seems really odd and a really poor design choice. This in itself isn't even the biggest problem. The Spirit Knight Stone system itself is really obscure and doesn't have a clear line of progression. The game doesn't clearly tell you which abilities can be equipped by what characters, which means that you're left in a logical sense thinking what the hell is going on, especially when you have Endia, who is a melee character. So you would think, oh, well, he must be able to equip all the melee techs, right? Well, no, actually he can only equip less than half of the melee attacks, and he randomly has the ability to use magical attacks for some unknown reason, and the game doesn't even tell you why that's the case. It doesn't explain the system correctly, and it pretty much ends up being a guessing game for the majority of the game. The whole character progression system, and indeed the item progression system, just isn't designed well at all, and I don't know why they thought that would be a good idea. And it may have been a good idea on paper, but you need to clearly explain that to a player. For the most part, for the first half of the game, I had no idea what techs were available for which characters, which meant that actually most of my characters went through the entirety of the game probably not being properly equipped. Now don't get me wrong, I'm all for experimentation and finding things out in games, but the problem is it's not experimentation when it's not open-ended. If the tech system was that you can basically equip any character or the majority of characters with any one tech, it would mean that I could build my characters the way I wanted them. So if I wanted to change a melee character to a magic user, it would be bad because their MP and their stats wouldn't reflect a magic user, but I could potentially do it. But you don't have that. What you have is a system that isn't clear, and it essentially becomes a system that leads to a lot of frustration, especially in the later levels when bosses are getting harder, enemies are hitting harder, and you're left with a bunch of text that you don't know where they go, to whose character they go, especially when you only have a set number of ingredients to actually build the Spirit Knight stones, and you have a party of 3 who are your main choice for a team, and you want to equip them, but you don't know which techs they can actually equip. At best, it was a poorly explained system. At worst, it was ultimately a poorly designed system. The aesthetic of the game, however, makes up for that in leaps and bounds. Tomiko Miyoshi's piano musical score is phenomenal. That, mixed with the snow-covered aesthetic and the nice colour palette, the visuals and the graphics aren't, AAA, Final Fantasy 15 graphics, but they produce a nice kind of indie feel and a nice, almost nostalgic retro feel to them that works really, really well. I have to say though that the musical score is really, really good, and it's worth purchasing just by itself. Overall, I Am Setsuna is a solid title mechanically and narratively, yet it remains a disappointing one. Its need to be validated by the title's long past have left the developers playing all too safe in every aspect of the game. Every single part of this game is unoriginal and looms in the shadow of its spiritual predecessors. While I would recommend it to fans of JRPGs because it is ultimately a good game despite its occasional odd design choice, I certainly feel that Square Enix have ultimately wasted a new IP that could have been so much more than a Chrono Trigger / Final Fantasy wannabe. A nod to past games is one thing, but when that drive to capture the past's nostalgia starts to hamper original design and narrative, you create a game that feels half of what it could have been. And that is my review of I Am Setsuna. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Do like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let me know what your thoughts on the game are, and I'll see you next time.